Yes, Sineha.
So welcome everybody. Welcome to the International Conference on the Representation of Violence in Literature and Culture 2021. We have three distinguished speakers with us today. Without further ado, let's begin. We have our first speaker, Begum Tuglu Atmer. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name.
No, it's okay.
Okay. So I'll just give a brief bio. She's currently working as a research assistant at the Department of English Language and Literature, Faculty of Letters, Edge University. She completed her PhD thesis in March 2018. She was an editorial assistant at the journal Interaction, a journal of British and American Studies, between the years 2013 and 2020. She's the editor of the newly founded Overton's Edge Journal of English Studies, which will be published with its first issue in January 2022. She is also working as a project coordinator at the European Languages and Cultures Research and Application Center, Edge University. Her research interests include Beckett studies, cultural studies, theory of novel, literary theory, and philosophy. We welcome you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction.
You will have 20 minutes. After that, we will open the floor for question and answers. Okay.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I also have to apologize for my voice. I think I'm coming down with something. I hope it's not the disease whose name must not be mentioned. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for that. But I do apologize that you have to bear with me with this voice for another 20 minutes. Now, if you let me, I think I can share my screen with you like this. Can you see it now? Let me see. Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So my title today is Who is to Blame? Justifying Violence in Titus Andronicus. And I want to begin by sharing my outline, because I do believe that these opportunities in symposiums help us a lot in broadening our ideas while turning the presentations into full papers while they're being published. So first, I want to introduce my ideas and where I want to begin. Before anything, I think I should thank also everyone who has organized this symposium. I've been attending like a couple of talks and it's been enlightening. So thank you so much before I begin with anything. So firstly, I want to speak a little bit about performing the self and creating the other, because I believe more than anything, Titus Andronicus is a play in which the English nationhood starts to show its first steps of turning into like a national identity. So therefore, there is a necessity for the self. And wherever you have the self, you have the other created at an immense effect. So the self here in Titus Andronicus is the Roman ideal, whereas on the other hand, the other turns into the Goths and the Moor. And I want to show you how violence, even though it's a subject and object kind of matter, there is an active agent of violence and a subject who is applying that violence to an object. But I want to show you how these self and the other concepts constantly interchange in the play. Therefore, I want to take a look at the Romans and the Goths and the Moor as the most outsider. So the first, I'll begin with the Romans, Titus, the pious soldier. We know that he is surnamed Pius. So he's in fact, I believe, the most excessive part of his character is being loyal and pious, and everything that he goes through is actually connected to that pious character of his. On the other hand, we have Saturninus. I mean, other critics have focused on Lucius and Marcus, but I didn't want to focus on them a lot as much as I did Saturninus, because I believe Saturninus is deemed to be an unworthy king because he was susceptible to the ideas of an evil seductress, that is Tamora, because Tamora is not only a woman, but she's a foreign woman. So there's a double effect of castration on Saturninus at that point. Saturninus is not worthy because he is open to Tamora's manipulation. So that is an open message to this Elizabethan audience, I believe. Be careful to protect the patriarchal order, or else chaos will ensue. Then I will move a little bit on the Goths. which who I call familiar strangers, because even though they start the play as being the enemy and the strangers, later on, Tamora turns into a queen and she becomes Rome incorporate. And Chiron and Demetrius act as if they are like the police force of Rome. And they kind of become familiar strangers. They're one of us. And they represent the other that we don't want to see in the Roman society. But what I'm willing to argue here is that there is no difference between the Goths and the Romans in terms of violence. The only thing that changes is how we justify the violence according to law and order, or according to being foreign or being a stranger. The more Aaron in this matter, I cannot place him within a single group of people. He is not part of the Goths, obviously, and he's the only Black character. And this has to show us wherever we have a Black character in Shakespeare, we know bad things are going to happen. So I wanted to concentrate on the Moor and how he's the designated villain. From the beginning of the play, we know that all the evil will be bestowed upon Aaron, and I will come to that in the forthcoming slides. So performing the self and creating the other. So how does the play construct this kind of a formation? On one hand, we have the sacred Romans, and we know that the Roman Empire, and I quote from Dunkel here.
Tamam yavaş ama bakayım ağzıma konuşamadım.
Sorry?
Allah.
Excuse me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Begum, hocam, we can hear you. Please go.
Okay, I thought there was a problem, sorry. So continuing, on one hand, we have the sacred Romans, and then versus the barbaric Goths. And I find that quite interesting because the Roman Empire, the Roman civilization, is one of the role models for the Western civilizations, and especially England. And I quote from Dunkel that the ancient Romans are credited with bringing civilization to the Western world. So they are like the epitome of what we understand by the concept of civilization. They are representatives of virtue, of value, of worth. Therefore, it's very interesting to see that these sacred Romans kind of like interchange places with their Goth outer parts, if you will. They're like mirror images to one another, but then you see that every image contains parts within that reflective image, if we are to go in a bit of Bobby's theory, Hami Baba's theories, for instance. So the self turns into the active violent subject in the very early times of the play. When the play opens, we find Titus victoriously coming back from war, and he actually turns a blind eye on Tamora's requests of saving her son. He's like, my soldiers deserve to kill your son. So that violence is immediately justified by Roman virtues of war and law and order and code. So if you're doing it in the name of the pride of your nation, suddenly the violent act is justified. But then towards the end of the play, once Titus starts to lose his mind, starts to lose his patriarchal power, he turns into the other, and he like swoops down to the level, if, in quotation marks, to the level of the Goths. And then he is able to take revenge upon the Goths. So there we see that the active violence subject turns into the passive object, and then again to the active violence. So this is like a cycle going on in the play, and it's not a constant cycle. It's constantly changing throughout the characters. So Mottram puts forward that England under the Tudors may have imagined itself an empire, but it was an empire mediated through the rhetoric of nationhood. So I believe that what we're watching on the play is in fact a representation of what the Elizabethan society wanted to see on stage. And they were both reinforcing the ideals of the Roman Empire, but at the same time trying to gather lessons from it, where they went actually wrong. As it is custom with Shakespeare, we are turning the tables from bottom to top. We are learning that even though being loyal to your code is virtuous, it can lead to your own destruction if it is not questioned properly. And Belvis argues that the play utilizes available discourses in Western civilization to perform violence. There's use of the classic as exemplified in the textual use of Ovid, and the use of the sacrifice as informed by the biblical stories to make the violence conform to the dominant discourses of the period. So we understand that even though the 21st century audience is shocked with all the rape and all the mutilation, all the bloodshed, this was not so shocking, perhaps, for the Elizabethan society, because they were already prepared by the discourses from their own ways of living. So starting off with Titus, the pious soldier, I want to show you exactly how pious he is. And in the very beginning, when Lucius wants a sacrifice from Titus, Titus directly gives Tamora's son. He doesn't even question it. And Tamora says, "Oh, cruel irreligious piety." So that's how Tamora is viewing Titus. Many in the time in the play, you hear the Goths addressing the Romans as being barbarous, the Romans as being cruel. And it's very interesting to see that Shakespeare is actually kind of deconstructing what we understand by the prime ideals of civilization. And look how Lucius wants the sacrifice as if he is a barbarous man. We may hew his limbs on an opile, ad menes fratrum sacrifice his flesh. So he is showing all kinds of primitive violence within himself. Moving forward, Titus is saying, well, my men deserve this kind of a sacrifice. I know I have taken like long quotations. I don't intend to read them. They're just there if you want to take a look at them with the lines and everything. Again, in another instant, we hear Lucius, when Titus mistakenly kills his own son, he isn't actually regretting this, because for the sake of the order, the sake of the state, he is willing to sacrifice his own son. That's how loyal, how pious he is. But he will be punished for this exact loyalty. Titus is following the rules while he's picking Saturninus for the head of the state. He is actually following tradition. And then he is following tradition when he is going after his own son. He is following tradition when he tries to rescue Lavinia from Basanius for the sake of being loyal to his emperor. But look what happens to him. Saturninus, an unworthy king, takes advantage of Titus, and at the very end, the tables turn on him. And moving forward, again, these are all the instances where Titus tries to show how honorable and how loyal he is to the state. And even when he has lost everything, he still wants to prove himself loyal against Saturninus. And all these quotations are revelations of this. When Aaron comes and wants to deceive Titus by saying, "You should chop off your hand for the sake of the emperor," Titus does not even question it. He just asks, "Which hand?" So he isn't even afraid of sacrificing one of his body parts for the sake of the state and to stick loyal to it. So this kind of a barbarous act of an emperor wanting a mutilated body part and the subject being willing to do this is actually protected by the state. It's law and order. It's the way we conform to being in a society. And Porcelli argues that in the classical world, whoever was outside the polis was considered barbarous. That's on us. We know this as a fact. But what's interesting in the play is, even though the Goths are defined as being fierce animals, like wilderness of tigers. And despite the opposition Roman barbarous, in Titus Sardonicus, Romans fail to represent civilization, justice, and virtue. We see how they are corrupted, and we understand that violence does not come from outside. Violence is not the making of a foreigner. It's not the making of an evil Moor, but it's rather the making of the city in which the community produces violence from within. So it's difficult to distinguish between the barbarians and the civilized in the play, hence making the audience and us question, where does the violence come from? So Cohen argues that the play, like the patriarchal culture which produces it, is a terrible wilderness where physical violence is simultaneously valorized and condemned. Titus's greatness rests, after all, is on his capacity to kill. So Titus is a soldier. All men we see on stage, and they're soldiers. Their primary life motive is to kill. So in this kind of a community, of a society, it is not a coincidence that violence is ensuing. But it's interesting that the play starts off without a head, and Titus wants to restore the head by picking Saturninus. But in that kind of like a metaphorical allusion to the body and to rationality, even though there is a head now on top, since the head is unworthy, since the central figure of authority cannot conform properly to the ideal, everything is turning into chaos. And so the violence is the real gift that not only Titus brings home from the war, but it's actually from within the home itself. So a little bit on Saturninus and why he is actually unworthy. Even though when we watch the play, we get the idea that Saturninus is kind of like a mysterious character and he is mischievous. And we understand that Bassanio is much more, let's say, justifiable in terms of being an emperor. I think the real fault in him is his weakness against the women. And for the Elizabethan society, this is just not acceptable. I mean, I understand that the Elizabethan society was ruled by a queen, but that queen herself, and I quote from her, had the heart and belly of a king. So it was something above the sexes. It was how the patriarchal society also molded female bodies to conform its own laws and orders. So here we have Tamora, who is defying all idealizations of Rome. And even though she was an outsider, now that she is queen, she has every right and every manner to control the Romans from within. And here she says, my lord, be ruled by me, be one at last, dissemble all your griefs and discontents. This is where she is trying to convince Saturninus to forgive Titus only for her own plans. It's interesting how the Romans, yes, they convert to violence to protect their country. The Goths to take revenge on what has happened to their country. But then we have Aaron, who has no motive at all. I mean, the only motive he might have is his relationship with Tamora. But then again, that is not really explained. And at the very end, when Aaron says, well, I only regret things that I haven't done, on the crimes that I haven't yet committed, there we understand that even though Goths are polar opposites of the Romans in certain manners, they are still the same race. They're still white, or they still look like the Romans. But Theron, on the other hand, he's a complete outsider, and therefore his evil, his violence has no motive at all. So there are different degrees of justifying violence throughout the play. And it's very interesting to see how it starts from the self, from the subject, moves toward the object, and then back to the subject again in a cyclical manner. So moving to Tamora, she is a familiar stranger, as I said. She is familiar because she is close in physical manners, in physical attributions to what you would have in Rome. But on the other hand, she is still an outsider. So even though she says, I'm incorporate in Rome, a Roman now adopted happily, we know that this adoption is only for revenge. Moving on with her sons, Demetrius and Chiron, I find interesting to have like symmetries in Shakespeare. And yet again, in this play, we also have a symmetry. We have the Goth brothers against the Roman brothers. And we see the Roman brothers sacrificing their hands for one another. They're willing to sacrifice their body parts, and they defend their brothers in Borno. And then we have Demetrius and Chiron, who constantly argue with one another, belittle one another. So we, on one hand, we have the Roman ideal of brotherhood, fraternity. But on the other hand, we have the Gothic understanding of like this mysterious, almost sexual tension, almost incestual tension between Demetrius and Chiron, which can be seen in several stage adaptations of Titus Andronicus. So it's interesting to see how Demetrius is willing to kill his baby brother by Aaron, right? I'll broach the tadpole on my rapiest point. Nurse, give it me, my sword shall soon dispatch it. So this is how violent he is. While on the other hand, Titus and Marcus and all the other brothers in the play on the Roman side constantly try to fight for one another. What I also find interesting in the Familiar Strangers is the moment Lucius forms an army and the moment he finds a way to collaborate with the Goths are like, okay, we're on board. As if they haven't been fighting for a very long time, as if their queen has not been abducted by the Romans. They immediately succumb to Lucius's order, as if to show that Romans are superior to the Goths to such an extent that the Goths are waiting the Romans to come and rescue them, or waiting for this opportunity to collaborate with the Romans. So I find that very interesting too. So even though they're displayed as like the mirror image of the Romans as the others, they're not the actual other. They're like the other in disguise. They're familiar in certain senses. But the actual other is the Moor, who is a designated villain. Now, I understand that this is a very long quotation, so I'll only read the first and the last lines. Aaron says, I am not, he doesn't regret anything that he's doing. I hadn't done a 10,000 more. Even now I curse the day. And then he goes on by listing all the innumerable crimes he is intending to commit. Nothing grieves me heartily indeed, he says, that I cannot do 10,000 more. So this evil goes unjustified in the play. And mind you, while this discussion is going on, Lucius wants to kill Aaron's baby. So Romans are willing to kill a baby mercilessly. But then it is the Moor, Aaron, who is the actual evil. Oh, sorry. So Brusher says that what is more disconcerting than from this act of evil is that the noble Titus must adopt Aaron's witty malice before he can exact his revenge, meaning that only until Titus turns into the other himself, only then he can take revenge on Aaron, because we have this duality in the play, and that is a representative of the Elizabethan society, if you ask me. On one hand, you have Titus, you have the Romans, you have kind of like this Apollonian and Dionysian like duality between them. While the Romans are open, yes, they have a military culture and they have reasons for what they're doing. While on the other hand, Aaron is kind of Dionysiac. You don't know what he's going to do. He's mysterious, and you cannot like trace or pinpoint his motives, which makes him even more scary. If you read Monster Theory, we can even say that Aaron is monstrous, depicted as a monster here. So the play at turns even takes a comic stance. The comic savagery mocks the apparently sane Roman values of Lucius and Marcus, while depriving us of conventional moral or tragic responses. So at the very end of the play, if we're feeling sorry for Titus and not for Aaron, it's because we are conditioned to believe so. It's because the Elizabethan audience has been conditioned to construct a national identity for themselves, and they have been carrying on this as a legacy. So as a conclusion, I quote from René Girard that the source of the evil is the community itself. And to continue with Zizek, that it's very symptomatic in our Western societies that even though we display such sensitivity to different forms of harassment, we're at the same time able to mobilize a multitude of mechanisms destined to render us insensitive to the most brutal forms of violence. So on one hand, we understand Titus. His daughter was raped. His whole virtue was in question. We understand Titus, we even feel sorry for him. But on the other hand, if we are blaming Aaron, that means that we are working those mechanisms that are influencing us to think otherwise. So there is no apparent motivation behind Aaron's actions apart from his evil self. Titus and the Romans, on the other hand, they're redeemed by extreme violence. At the very end, it's almost as if they have paid their share and they have bailed themselves out of the consciousness of what they've done. Their past violent actions are justified in juxtapositions with the gods have done to Lavinia, to all the other characters. So even though at the very end, the play seems to be reinforcing the Roman ideals of order through violence and apparent racial discrimination in defining the source of evil, it simultaneously attacks the very foundations of such ideals by punishing the Romans in an extreme manner for their loyalty to their traditions. And that was my final words. If you want to take a look at my work cited and the images that I have used throughout my slide, these are the links. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. Particularly, I just going to add something. It reminded me of another play, that is Othello, and you're talking about the designated Moor, and how Othello's national identity had also created, him being different from other Venetians had also been led to all the destructions that he faced later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your contribution. Thank you.
So we will be moving on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Neslihan Koroglu. She works as a lecturer at Azmir Katib Celebi University School of Foreign Languages. She graduated from Edge University English Language and Literature Department. After having earned her MA degree at Dokuz Elul University, American Studies Department, she received a PhD from Edge University English Language and Literature Department with a dissertation, Shakespeare Retold, Contemporary Visions of the Bird in 2020. She was a visiting researcher at Newcastle University for a research project funded by Tubitak in 2019. Her main research interests include Shakespeare studies, literary theory, women's literature, and environmental studies. We welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sana, for your warm welcome. And thank you, Begum, for your illuminating presentation, as always. And now we are going to Cecilia, from the bloody battlefields to a royal palace with Winter's Tale. And now my presentation is entitled The Winter's Tale and Domestic Violence, Tyranny in the Household. And let me start. When The Winter's Tale, which is a 1610 play of William Shakespeare, first appeared in the first folio in 1623, as you can see, the classification assigned to this play, this late career play, was a comedy. Contemporaries of William Shakespeare must have thought that The Winter's Tale would align best with the features of comedy, because the play cheered the Jacobean audience with the themes and plotline it includes: reunion of lovers, a newly found lost child, a promising marriage between two kingdoms, a character reanimated miraculously, shifts in time, multiplicity in space, its pastoral setting, and maybe with its most echoed state direction, exit pursued by a bear. And it was not until 1875 The Winter's Tale was suggested to be grouped as romance by Irish critic and poet Edward Dowden. So, to Dowden's argument, Shakespeare's last four plays, Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, are neither tragedies nor comedies. They are not history plays either, but a separate genre with their own distinctive characteristics. The Winter's Tale has been then considered as a romance combining tragedy and comedy elements together along with other three, and which has raised discussions, as some critics and scholars have also addressed the text as the problem play, Although the category of problem play has been widely defined and not widely accepted by all critics and academics, it has been generally used for Shakespeare's plays. It has been generally used for Shakespeare plays which are hard to be categorized. And most of these plays, especially romances alternately read as problem plays, owe such categorization of problem play to their genre-violating features for combining tragedy and comedy. But it seems that such a categorization is a contentious business, because The Winter's Tale starts as a comedy, turns out to be a tragedy, and then again it turns out to be a comedy, and in which the importance of forgiveness and repentance, a reunion, is championed. It is crowned at the end of the play. But let me explain you that, especially after 1980s, with the impact of or with the effect of new critical schools, much scholarship hasn't been mounted on problem plays, because there has been a tendency to approach any text as problematic from various of views when the issues of gender, race, class, sexual orientation, and whatever, when they are considered. So in this respect, I contend that The Winter's Tale needs not to be explored within the boundaries of problem play genre, yet I suggest a derivation from the adjective problem toward problematize, because I think it's a crucial move when one explores violence in the violence the play includes. This might disturb the scholarship, I think, which has long concentrated on the romance elements of the play, psychological motives of Leontes madness, the reasons of Leontes madness, a statue scene in the play, time gaps between acts, but yet When Winter's Tale is analyzed through the lenses of violence studies, much importance needs to be attached to the play as it's being the tragedy of the household, because it deciphers how a patriarchal tyrant perpetrates domestic violence against his wife and children in the forms of verbal, emotional, psychological, and physical abuse. Therefore, this paper aims to problematize The Winter's Tale as a romance and discuss the multi-layered forms of violence it exhibits. Before exploring domestic violence in the play, a brief look in the synopsis would be illuminating for the scope of the discussion, because The Winter's Tale is an overlooked play of William Shakespeare. I mean, scholarship has not been that much like other tragedies or comedies. Like, there is not, let's say, enough scholarship or much scholarship like Othello, Macbeth, maybe Titus Andronicus as well. So The Winter's Tale opens with Bohemian king Polixenes plans to return home after 6 months he spent in Sicilia with King Leontes and Queen Hermione. Yet Leontes accuses his pregnant wife of adultery instantly, and his best friend of seducing his wife without any apparent reason or proof. Obsessed with his groundless suspicion, the king orders his chief counselor, Camillo, to poison Polixenes. Yet Camillo warns the king that they together flee to Bohemia. Meanwhile, Queen Hermione is imprisoned and taken to court despite the warnings of the lords. There she bears her daughter Perdita, whom Leontes kills too, in Leontes' orders to be killed first. But then the king modifies his mind about disposing the infant on a remote place and leave her in the hands of fate. Although Paulina, lady-in-waiting of the queen, begs for the mother and the child's life, he doesn't listen because he acts like a tyrant. Upon the king's request, Hermione is taken to court and messengers to consult the oracle in Delphi are sent. The words of the oracle arrive during the public trial, proving that it is Leontes' fault. I mean, what happened is about all his suspicion, and he would be heirless if the lost child isn't found. And meanwhile, in the court scene, which is maybe shocking or might be ridiculous to today's audience, the news announcing the death of Hermione and Leontes' son Mamilius because of grief arrived to the court. And then Hermione faints and she's carried away by Paulina, who subsequently reports the death of the queen. And Leontes remains in grief and vows to spend the rest of his life in repentance. And then Perdita is found by a shepherd, and then miraculously 16 years pass and the chorus time as chorus enters, and then after that, with some, you know, like the events follow each other, and at the end of the play, Hermione, who was a statue, at once becomes alive, and then the families are reunited. That's a story of happily living happily ever after story. It turns out to be a happily living after story. But I think that let's say the happy ending of the romance, which miraculously revives the faith in resurrection, repentance, and forgiveness, with its famous statue scene violating any realistic expectations, is apparently a let's say patriarchal illusion, because this text carries the weight of violence. The Winter's Tale is a play in which tyranny plays a significant role in a domestic setting, and when we speak of a tyrant, no room for romance in its positive connotation is spared. As Robin Cormack contends, tyranny in The Winter's Tale is not the violent, let's say, is not the violent suppression of the nobility or usurpation of a crown, but it is a royal husband's violent fantasy that his wives belong to another. Descending into madness in domestic sphere, Leontes begins to act like a tyrant, convincing himself being betrayed. From this point of view, Leontes' passion is erotic and finds its space in domestic. It is not about violence projected on a nation, but on a household. So, in Paul Siegel's opinion, Leontes fits into the pattern of Shakespeare's other notable tyrants, such as Macbeth and Richard III, when explored in the context of Elizabethan genre of tyrant tragedy, which is also often very common in Greek tragedy. In tyrant tragedy, according to the tyrant tragedy, a tyrant is inevitably punished for the Elizabethan treatment of his career, follows a strict pattern of elaborate poetic justice. Inwardly, he is tortured by his vicious passions and his censorious conscience. Outwardly, he walks in incessant fear and suspicion. His life is short, his death is sudden and violent, and hereafter he must expect only the tortures of the damned. The usurping tyrant who kills a king to gratify the passion of ambition is guilty of a attack upon the hierarchy of order and degree instituted by natural law, and his awful fate is a punishment eminently just. So, although Shakespeare devises a different ending for Leontes because it's a romance, indeed. The play is a romance, but we cannot deny that the king is being driven by his vicious, groundless passions, similar to all tyrants in Shakespeare's work. He has no fear and suspicion in his toes, playing death to his counselors like all tyrants. Although we do not see a murdered king on the stage, like let's say, like in the play Macbeth, for example, we see a murdered king, but we don't see this in this play. But he attempts to kill Polixenes, but it is a romance, so we just don't see it on the screen, but there's an attempt. In Tyrant, Shakespeare on Power, Stephen Greenblatt speaks of Leontes as a tyrannical figure with emphatic insistence and on his wife adultery and sudden onset of paranoia due to his impulsive behavior leads to the tragedy of a family. By constructing a narrative of betrayal, he is the chief perpetrator of domestic violence. So, when a historicist reading is applied to the play, one can explain the issue of domestic violence with the imagination of family and Renaissance women. But in Jacobean England, the husband had supreme power over his wife and children, and the royal family, as the microcosm in the macrocosm, reflected the social conduct. In a word, the deeds and the words of women were not found credible, which can also be seen during the court scene in the play, when Hermione claims her innocence by saying, as you can see, if power is divine, behold your human actions as they do. I doubt not then, but innocence shall make false accusations blush, and tyranny tremble at patience. Leontes proactively denies by relying on his supreme power as the king and the husband and the patriarch of the nation, and goes even further to defame her role as a woman in domestic setting. As it has also been stated in the call for paper of this conference, the definition of the concept domestic violence has undergone some change and clarifications during the decades. Although domestic violence was usually associated with intimate partner violence, particularly involving murderous acts in the form of physical violence, it then has been extended and included other types of violence. European Institute for Gender Equality glossary on rape, femicide, and intimate partner violence lists 9 definitions for domestic violence approved by institutions around the world, and among them a well-documented definition of domestic violence, which has been stated at Istanbul Convention, which was signed in 2011, defines domestic violence as follows. All acts of physical, sexual, psychological, or economic violence that occur within the family or domestic unit or between former or current spouses or partners, whether or not the perpetrator shares or has shared the same residence with the victim. This comprehensive definition, pointing out 4 forms of violence, regardless of the time and space it has been perpetrated, leads us to think about violence in different types of abuse. My intention is to focus on domestic violence as an umbrella concept in The Winter's Tale and explore types of abuse in psychological, verbal, emotional, and physical forms. But I would like to note that psychological violence is often used with emotional or verbal abuse interchangeably. So clarifying these concepts is a really hard job, which might be clearer in the paper or in the proceedings. But to lay bare the multi-layered and this interwoven violence better, I will only focus on 3 characters, Hermione, Mamilius, and Perdita. This doesn't mean that the other characters are not subjected to violence in the play, but that might be another paper scope. So now, if we focus on Hermione, Camillo, as I said, flees to Bohemia. I mean, there is an option for him, but the option which is possible for Camillo, I mean, fleeing from the country, is not possible for the queen. As she has been under suspect, she has been subjected to physical violence through the threat of death in prison and psychological violence in various forms. Now, according, as you can see, just one of the picture here, and as you can see in the presentation, according to the definition of the World Health Organization, the forms of psychological violence can be listed as follows: insults, belittling, constant humiliation, intimidation, threats of harm, threats to take away children, which is really visible in The Winter's Tale. Likewise, the European Institute of Gender Equality states an overall definition of psychological violence, which can be understood from the perspective of caused harm. Any act or behavior which causes psychological harm to the partner or former partner. Psychological violence can take the form of, among others, coercion, defamation, and a verbal insult or harassment. I mean, when we explore in depth, all can be seen in The Winter's Tale. Let me say, okay, Lindsay Kaplan and Catherine Eggert state that The Winter's Tale concerns itself with slanders to women's reputations. It also engaged a series of other transgressions, particularly associated with women: adultery, petty treason, bastardy, infanticide, scalding, and witchcraft. And when Camillo attempts to counter Leontes' fear of having been betrayed, the king speaks of his wife as an adulteress, as you can see, like is leaning cheek to cheek, is meeting noses, kissing with inside lip, like, I mean, directing all his suspicions to her, maybe his, let's say, expressions, we call like madness of him, and waiting for her childbirth and taking care of his son Mamilius, serving as the good, gracious hostess to her husband's best friend. The queen fulfills all expectations. Although it is Leontes who requests her to beg Polixenes to extend his visit in Sicilia, Hermione, my dearest, who never spoke to better purpose, Leontes, with a sudden outburst, condemned his wife of infidelity, and he expresses his suspicions in an aside. Too hot, to mingle friendship far as mingling bloods. I have tremor chords in me, my heart dances, but not for joy, he says. I mean, like, trying to say that the queen was having a sexual intercourse with with his best friend. And being suspicious of the queen again, he asks his boy Mamilius that, Mamilius, are thou my boy? The accusations can be right, but no credit is given to her speech. And I must say that there is the verbal offense in the play, like there are many examples, but one of the, I think, most striking example of it is defaming the queen, and silencing her is also a verbal violence, because Hermione is like one of the sleeping beauties in literature. She is on the stage, disappears 16 years, and then comes back again just to forgive the patriarch, just to forgive the tyrant. And this is, I think, real violence to a character. And now I'm reaching the end of my presentation. Here is the Mamilius, the boy, and the Perdita in the play. And violence in the Winter's Tale is best summed up in Francis Dolan's comments on the play. Dolan states that the Winter's Tale turns a story of familial conflict into a fantasy of resolution, like Shakespeare's other romances, excludes mother from the action. She returns in order to forgive the father, not particularly for his role in the death of one child and the abandonment of another, but for jealous, tyrannical treatment of her. When we do not explore this poem in the Winter's Tale, I think the violence the play inhibits will be invisible. And according to some critics, according to Belsi, Mamilius is just dies of grief, because of the psychological violence. And as for Perdita, she means hope and rebirth. She's subjected to emotional violence from the very beginning of her life. And because she was left on a shore unprotected, and she was just left to be that, or by chance she might live. And she was just a little infant at the time. But first her father orders her execution, but she was innocent. Why? What does she do to Leontes? It's just the tyrant's obsession. And Siegel, according to Siegel contends that, like Richard's murder of the young princess and Macbeth's murder of Macduff's children, the same thing is done by Leontes to Perdita. Her happy marriage at the end of the play does not conceal that she has not been subjected to emotional, physical, and psychological violence. And in reaching to end of my presentation, I would like to conclude that through the lenses of violence studies, The Winter's Tale is a domestic tragedy through which we confront a pathological tyrant in imperative mode, silencing the voice of women and children and causing their destruction as innocent victims. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't exceed the time.
Thank you so much for your presentation. In most of the Shakespearean plays, we either have seen the pedestalization of women and the subjugation. They have never been treated as an equal like other men, right? And the voice had always been distorted in either way. So it was so nice hearing you. So we have our last speaker for the session, Pinar Yilmaz. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. She works as an English drama teacher at Dobru's Tattoo University, Izmir, Turkey. She graduated from the Department of American Culture and Literature at H University. After having spent 4 years at Edge University Theatre Club during her BA study, she specialized on performing and directing at studio plays founded by Sahika Tekar. Since her graduation from studio plays, she has been leading workshops on performing, focusing on somatic elements of acting. After having got her MA degree at Essex University East 15 Acting School, Theatre Directing Department in England, she taught textual analysis, dramaturgy, staging and acting at Maltese University Faculty of Fine Arts, Performing Arts Department. As an independent theatrical project, she rewrote and directed Exile in 2013. The performance had its premiere at Istanbul State Theatre. In 2021, she wrote and directed Double. The performance had its online premiere at 39th International Izmir Theatre Festival in 2021. In 2017, she started her PhD study at Dokko's Iliul University Performing Arts Department. She's currently working on a dissertation, Cosmogonic and Performative Elements in Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Since her first published book, she has been publishing at literary and theatrical magazines, some of which are Rizgar, Tebium. Her main interests include theater studies, performative aesthetics, physicality and movements as a somatic language and performing arts. We welcome you. You may begin.
Thank you very much. I am very sorry again about my voice. And I will get as much as help from my PowerPoint slides because of the weakness of my voice. I hope it doesn't work that bad for you. And now we are moving on to the last part of Shakespeare's session, which is not the least, I guess, as I will talk about Hamlet. And let me share my screen. Is it okay about my voice? Just let me know, please. I don't know what I can do, but I will try something. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes. Can everybody see my screen as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. We can see.
Yeah. Yes, we can see your screen. I mean,
okay. Yes, the violence of language in Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. I'll start with a quotation from Leontes, a cognitive scientist, who says that human minds have invented not one cognitive universe, but 7,000, as there are 7,000 languages in the world that are spoken right now. I can't deny anything that has been said about Hamlet, but I can't prove it either. I could probably be wrong by leaving out many things in the window I will open towards Hamlet in this 15 minutes presentation by focusing only on language today. But was Hamlet right? We don't know. I will shortly talk about how structural linguists like Edward Saphir and cognitive scientist Leontes theorize how language shapes thought and try to rethink Hamlet in the given situations of this linguistic theory. Sorry. In other words, I will try to inject some Hamlet in linguistics to think all together here as you, me, Hamlet, and language. I'm very sorry. It has been widely accepted in academia that 19th century has been the information era and 20th century as the language communication era for the world. While the thing that united the whole academia and all disciplines was for a long time putting the scientific perspective to the fore, interdisciplinary communication interaction started to gain importance in 20th century. The 21st century, on the other hand, bears the burden of entire history of humanity, emphasizing especially anti-violent, peaceful communication. Whatever we say, we create a living space on the ground, and during the time we say, we create a life, and the traces of this life spread to the world with the participants of this space. That is how it leaves its mark on an area like life that's contagious at all times. That's why I would like to thank to the organizing committee of this conference to have given us this chance to spread peace rather than violence by trying to contribute on the awareness towards the issue. Turning back to 20th century, we can observe that the first half of the century has been mostly shaped as a recognition period of newly explored or recognized languages and their grammatical structures, while the other second half has borne a much more complex approach towards the relation, I am crying, between the language and the culture it has been grown into, which can be summarized as which one precedes the other, language or culture. The discussion whether language shapes thought, culture in wider sense, as an entire system, or thought, culture shapes language as a tool, has been an unending discussion for linguistics in the last century, of which culture was mostly thought to be a priori of the language due to the fact that culture offered more concrete material for research than mind, where language is originally created. Cognitive scientist Lara Borodowski states in her article how language shapes thought. But now, decades later, a solid body of empirical evidence showing how just a second. Sorry. Showing how language-shaped thinking has finally emerged. The evidence overturns the long-standing dogma about universality and yields fascinating insights into the origins of knowledge and the construction of reality. It turns out the way we think, thought, or culture influences the way we speak, language. But the influence also goes the other way. The way we speak language influences the way we think, thought, or culture. Many thinkers and linguists think that language is a lens that can shape thought. By changing their perspective sorry. Oh. Sorry. Many thinkers and linguists think that language is a lens that can shape thought by changing their perspective by the syntax of a language. The most famous theory that accepts language as a lens is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, the grammatical structure of language directly affects people's perception of the world. Sapir expresses his thoughts on the relationship between language and thought in his article, The Status of Linguistics as a Science, as follows. It is quite an illusion to imagine that one adjusts to reality essentially without the use of language, and that language is merely an incidental means of solving problems of communication or reflection. The fact of the matter is that the real world is, to a large extent, unconsciously built up on the language habits of the group. No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same worlds with different labels attached. With these statements, Sapir claims that the structural organization of language determines and limits thought. Moreover, language is able to control the processes of thought, such as classification and perception. Turning back to Lara Borodowski, she concludes her article stating that the past decade has seen a host of ingenious demonstrations establishing that language indeed plays a casual role in shaping cognition. Studies have shown that changing how people talk changes how they think. Teaching people new color words, for instance, changes their ability to discriminate colors. And teaching people a new way of talking about time gives them a new way of thinking about it. Below, I will summarize some of her observations and experiments mentioned in her article. Yeah. Cook theory language from now on will be called as KT people. This language is spoken by an Aboriginal community who lives in Pormpurawa, Australia. They don't use the spatial words like right and left. Instead, everything is in cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. Very sorry. For example, the cup is southeast of the plate. Analysis of this situation for Brodowski is that people who think differently about space are also likely to think differently about time. Language calibrates how they think about time. And there's an experiment on time in which they give sets of pictures that show temporal progressions. A man aging, a crocodile growing, a banana being eaten, and asked to put them in order. The process is Turkish and English speakers would probably organize them from left to right. But if you think in Arabic or Hebrew, you might do it in the opposite direction, from right to left. And Japanese and Chinese speakers do it from top to bottom. This shows that writing direction in a language influences how we organize time. But how would the KT people order time if they don't use the words right and left? The answer is that they arrange the pictures from east to west. What does this mean? Before trying to understand what it means, let's look at how we perceive it. For me, for example, if I face north, this P is me. If I face north, time goes from north to east. Time goes from northeast to northwest. If I turn west, time goes from northwest to southwest. If I turn south, time goes from southwest to southeast. If I turn east, time goes from southeast to northeast. This way, it is obvious that I am at the center of time, and the direction of time changes every time I turn my body, which could definitely mean I am watching the world. Let's go back to KT people. When they were seated facing south, they organized time from left to right. When they were seated facing north, they organized time from right to left. But of course, you see here the same direction here because they don't turn their backs in this slide. They organized time from right to left. And when they were seated facing east, time came towards the front of the body of KT people. And when they were seated facing west, time came towards the back of the KT people's bodies again. And they were never told which direction they were facing. And Brodowski analyzes this as, for KT people, time doesn't actually get locked on the body. It gets locked on the landscape, which is a dramatically different way of thinking about time, which might mean I am being watched.
Pınar Hocam,
Buyurun hocam.
if you feel very bad, Neslihan Hoca can read rest of your paper, or you will finish.
Is it too bad for you to listen?
No, we are okay, but if you cannot go on, then
Okay,
If you just feel really bad, I have the paper. Just remind me where you stopped and I can go on, and then stop me and make comments.
okay, thank you very much. I'll try a little bit more.
Okay.
Okay, thank you again. And Brodowski again says in one of her interviews, the beauty of linguistic diversity is that it reveals to us just how ingenious and how flexible the human mind is. Human minds have invented not one cognitive universe, but 7,000. And now I'm passing through Hamlet. Which direction does Hamlet go? Language is a virus from outer space. Young quote in the chapter Hamlet of the mid-century in his book Shakespeare Our Contemporary states that the bibliography of dissertations and studies devoted to Hamlet is twice the size of Warshaw's telephone directory. Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, has been known as the second of the pieces that has been mostly quotation after Bible. Pursuing the ironically religious status of the piece, we could probably state the most important difference between two by their discourse as the former Bible, is structured mostly with answers, while the second is rather with questions. Hamlet definitely is not the only piece that's made out of questions, but what makes it unique is that he unconsciously pushes the boundaries of language while forming his questions. He was probably intellectually a curious digger already before his father's death and his mother's marrying to his uncle. Yet what escalated his unrest could be summarized in below lines between him and his loyal friend Horatio. My lord, I came to see your father's funeral. I prithee, do not mock me, fellow student. I think it was to see my mother's wedding. When the words funeral and wedding come to have the same meaning, Hamlet loses his confidence in language. It is no more a reliable tool, neither to communicate with his own thoughts nor with others. In other words, the challenging power of Hamlet originates from his doubt of language, and yet it is the only tool he has to go beyond it. Yet he is intellectual and scared enough to think that when he reaches the beyond, he might probably find himself falling from the setup walls of Truman Show movie, where neither the stairs made of language to the beyond, nor the beyond itself will no more be available. In this case, while it wouldn't be wrong to quote from Edward Ball about the nucleus of the play as simply about a son, a father, a mother, a girlfriend, and an uncle, yet it wouldn't be right enough to put it without the conflict between Hamlet and the language. Because once he loses his confidence about the absolute truthfulness of the external world showed to be offered by language, he doubts his internal way of being doubtful of thinking as well, as it is also established by language too. And going back to Brodowski again, what she says about Isaac Newton as follows. Sometimes a new word comes in because it captures perfectly an experience that people have been having. Language and thought exist in this reciprocal relationship, and there are many reciprocal cycles of influence. When Isaac Newton was figuring out his ideas about force and gravity, there was no language for talking about gravity. There was no language for talking about force. He was trying to figure those ideas out, and if you look at his notebooks as he was writing about these ideas, he was writing out different words. He was saying things like vigor, vitality, strength, power, which made no sense at all for the time being. Maybe Hamlet couldn't work on his mind as sufficiently as Newton, we don't know. Within a language-made mind, he tried to find out what could avoid to be a part of language. A little undefinable feeling or thought maybe, which just right immediately after being experienced would turn out to be more like a Trojan horse, exploding all the possible exits in the globe and swallowed by a dark hole like that marked in the screen painting of Edvard Munch, as if having been violated and to be violated recurringly by the end of his very own challenge, like the hero with 1,000 faces, in 1,000 times in 7,000 languages, in order not to let her pass through this forbidden gesture completely, pushed upon the delaying button instead, which makes this ironically reversed biblical piece contemporary for all ages. The most famous Hamlet actor, Laurence Olivier, in his memoirs on Hamlet, says that when an actor first attempts to play Hamlet, he must realize that Hamlet is a messy collection of his own dramatizations in which he tries to play the hero and in fact feels sick on the other hand. Hamlet's imagination works as if he were a hero, but he is struck by the bold brilliance of a writer who has decided to write the play of a hero whose soul cannot be a hero. While the main action of the play, questioning the language, makes the protagonist, Hamlet of course, the hero of the play, watching, spying his own allegedly delirium, mostly hesitantly, mostly disguised in inaction or reversed action, watches his own antagonist at the core by turning the hero into the zero repeatedly, more like the two legs of a compassus rising from language-based hero to zero at the Greenwich sand watch of Shakespeare. Whenever he hears the bell, he turns back to the zero position as if the words do not heal, yet hung up to his actual ankle, shattered yet bound by blood, which ties and dismembers at the same time by keeping the wound together with the body. The blood flows within, that is life, and the blood flows within, that is continuous wound, bleeding into more swords, which are at the same time a tourniquet and a deeper incision. Probably words had never been this much interruptive of themselves so far, apart from being called absurd. In Hamlet words, the translation of Genesis turns into a reversed memetics rather than mimesis, which puts the twin brothers, Zero and Hero, as the two sides of the creation and as the two sides of the greatest artifact of the created, language. Whenever he hears the curtain bell, he rehearses his forbidden gesture of fear. Whenever he hears the curtain bell, he is beaten by the unavoidable swords of the words of the world. Whenever he hears the curtain bell, he aims at every single word with his poisonous sword. Thoughtful as the gods, limping as the words of his mind. Whenever he hears the curtain bell, he thinks as much as God, but not good enough to be a word or not, to be a word or not, to be a word or not. Whenever he hears the curtain bell, he trembles on the mind as a question, old, unchanging, blinded in the world of too many answers. Whenever he hears the curtain bell, he has been negated just on that very glimpse of comprehension and endlessly buried in the portrait of a dark hole of the screen to ring and ring and ring again. Whenever he hears the curtain bell, he lies the unspeakable from left to right as a Western narrative of doubt. Whenever he hears the curtain bell, he acts brave or scared enough to restart the sweet violence of the words, and the rest is silence, as his last line before he dies. And yet asks Bernardo at the beginning, who is there to speak? From violent to none. Thank you for listening and your understanding of my voice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can we now open the floor for some questions, discussions, or if anybody wants to ask?
I think we have a question in the chat section. Have you seen it? Or am I the only one who's reading it?
I've seen it.
Um,
I think we can unmute ourselves because the question is for all of us.
yeah, I thought so.
So we can.
What is it? Yeah, what's it with Shakespeare, right? What's the deal with Shakespeare?
Yeah, I think the question is that why are you studying Shakespeare again?
Shakespeare still after all these years.
Yeah, all these years. Begum, would you like to start, or I mean, in a line?
I did see the question first, so I might as well. Well, I think what makes us read him again and again is his universality in it. The way he encapsulates human nature and the way he just brilliantly pours it into words. I mean, and when reading Titus Andronicus, I mean, it's not a play for the faint-hearted. It must have shocked the audience back in 1594, but it still shocks us today because it's still very relevant. The bloodshed is going on, the violence is going on, and all the things that Neslihan Hocam said, Pınar Hocam said, it's the way we see the world, it's the way we perceive the world, and it's been put into words in a brilliantly poetic manner, which is something we cannot find in the 21st century now, do we? We don't have time for poetics anymore in the way that the Renaissance people did, perhaps. So that's my answer. Being universal and quite personal all at the same time is the reason why we cannot give up Shakespeare.
So shall I? My dissertation is on Shakespeare. It was rewriting Shakespeare, and when they asked me what I was going to study for my dissertation, I just told the jury that it's Shakespeare and say, again, Shakespeare. What are you going to do with Shakespeare again and do something that is studied less? So I started to just study rewriting Shakespeare. I would like to quote Ben Jonson, like he's not for an age, but for all ages. And I mean, I see Shakespeare's plays, like, I mean, being in a wardrobe and there are a lot of things to wear, and then you just choose one and do everything with it. I mean, you can, there are many layers in a play so that you can look at Shakespeare from very different angles. And he is, I mean, he is the heart in the canon, in the Western canon as well. I mean, so whenever you say Shakespeare to somebody, everybody knows it. So he's one of the most quoted, I mean, not one of the, he's the most quoted writer in the world history. And so that I think Shakespeare can be a like common ground to discuss the questions that we would like to ask in literature, culture, and arts. That's why I chose Shakespeare for discussion. Thank you.
And I agree with what has been said, and I will disagree later when my voice is stronger. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions from? So I just want to ask a common question. So basically, it's for everyone. Like, how do you think, like, if you take a bird's eye view of reading the Shakespearean plays, how do you think he has placed violence over the years, and how is it changed through all his plays? Can you just tell something?
Sorry, I couldn't hear the beginning of your
I can get your voice.
Am I audible?
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, so I was asking that if we take a bird's eye view of all the Shakespearean plays, not being concentrated on whatever we have been discussing, not only what we have discussed today, how do you think that he has placed violence in his plays, and how it has changed over time, maybe in respect to what socio-political condition that he was in? What do you think?
You mean particularly in Shakespearean era, or you say from Shakespearean era from Jacobean England to the
yeah, from the transition I'm talking about.
I mean, to the contemporary times.
Yeah.
Anyone who would like to
start? I think it's gotten softer, hasn't it? It's much more violent back in the Elizabethan times. The 21st century modern audience, we are so indulged in political correctness that we cannot go as blunt as Shakespeare would have gone. So I think the first primordial thing we should focus on is how the play's gotten more adaptations, more softer at times. in the name of originality, each director has chosen to meddle with and temper with the certain parts of the play and make it more convenient for the modern day audience. So the transition between the Elizabethan and Jacobean society towards a modern society, I think that's the primary difference from what we have in the plays and the adaptation of the plays. But that's on me.
I also agree with you. I mean, it depends on the adaptation or the appropriation of the play. I mean, with purpose it has been adapted or appropriated. I think Elizabethan and Jacobean audience love seeing blood on the stage. I mean, not real blood in reality, but they love to see such violent scenes because theater was their only, form of entertainment at the time. But as for the years, I think the concept of violence or the depiction of the concept of violence on stage differ according to the era in which it was explored. I mean, I don't believe that. I mean, I'm not really knowledgeable about this issue, but I'm not very sure about whether, I mean, in other eras like the 19th century, I mean, like in the Romantic period, Shakespeare was depicted as like too much blood on the stage. I don't think so. So I think it also depends on the choice of the director and the actor or the actress. I mean, how you approach to the play.
I mean, Neslihan, you made me think of how the recent adaptations I watch on Shakespeare, they're more abstract, aren't they? I mean, instead of, let's say, portraying Lavinia with cut off hands, they put like ribbons or parts of trees, or instead of showing how devastated she is, they put makeup on instead of using like blood-like colors and more gruesome scenes. So I think it's grown much more abstract, but perhaps the way we perceive violence is much more abstract now, instead of like having real face-to-face violence, which is of course the problem of the world too, but the kind of violence that gets us through invisible means, the violence of capitalism, for instance, I think that has a lot to play on how we perceive modern day adaptations too. And at the same time, you made me think of how the Elizabethan and Jacobean community, they were watching public executions. Yeah. They were watching people being mutilated on the roads every day. So pretty much perhaps that is why we have different representations on stage now.
I think Clara has written something. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Yep.
Maybe I should read out loud. It's because he might be marking the thought of human being as the main location of the violence. It's part of human nature, perhaps, to be violent.
I mean, to some extent, each of us is violent. Yeah, I mean, and Shakespeare.
Yeah. True. So true.
In a really, I think, realistic way. But sometimes I can't say the same thing for the romances. I mean, he's not realistic as well because he was coming to the end of his life. Maybe he was really bored with what he was doing in Stratford. I really don't know. But but I think he just wanted to give us some faith. I mean, to forgive the passing.
Perhaps he softened with age.
Yeah, could be. But he was having a good time.
But about the violence, I mean, even when two people are communicating, such as the communication form of you and I now, one is the active talking subject and the other one has to listen. So that is a kind of violence of me, just kind of like meddling in the thought process of you. So being a human is all about those power relations and how we control the violent desires that are within us, perhaps. And maybe Shakespeare is so famous and so timeless and eternal and international because he manages to encapsulate that part of us quite honestly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions or?
By the way, I just want to say that I'm really happy to be here with my two colleagues. We are indeed all friends and came across during our graduate or undergraduate studies. So I think it is a coincidence, a chance, a time in a million. So I'm really happy to be here with you. And thank you, Sena, for your kind welcome for us and sharing the session. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone too. I mean, it's been amazing presenting with friends and colleagues. I felt like I'm just having a discussion with, one of our usual discussions that we do outside. So it was brilliant to have this opportunity. Thank you so much. Oh, we also have another comment from Punaraja, if you haven't seen it. She'd also mentioned about the performative aspects of playing within a Shakespeare language, which for most performers would find hard because of their depth, both physical and meaningful perspectives. Exactly. Because obviously I'm at the Faculty of Letters, I focus on the letters, but it's very interesting to see how the performance side is also quite influential here, right? The performers would find a hard time because of their depth, certainly.
So, Punari's interest in performance, performance studies. I mean, her main area is performance studies, although she's a graduate of literature. But I would like to ask, do you sing Hamlet on stage? Within this performative boundaries or limitations, do you ever plan to direct Hamlet on the stage then, if you are really that much keen on play? Yeah, of course.
Looking forward to watch it then.
Life starts after PhD.
Reserve our places in that play, please. We'll be in the first row.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you guys.
Thank you.
The next session is about to start, as I'm being told, and thank you so much. It has been a wonderful, wonderful session. I'm really so happy and excited after hearing all those insightful thoughts, and thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.